Good afternoon, and welcome to the second webinar of the Empowering Voting and Democracy series. My name is Gena Gunn McClendon, and I am the Community Engagement Director and manage the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative at the Center for Social Development in the Brown School of Social Work, Public Health, and Social Policy at Washington University in St. Louis, and will serve as your moderator today. I just want to give you a little heads up that we're having extreme weather today. So there may be an issue. And if there is, please bear with us and we'll be back online as soon as possible. CSD is the Center for Implementing and Testing Applied Social Innovations that broaden the well-being of individuals, families, and communities. Dr. Michael Sheridan is the founding director of the center, which began over 25 years ago. We engage in 7 areas of impact: financial inclusion, race, inequality, and social mobility, social justice, child and youth well-being, environment and social development, thriving communities, and democracy and civic engagement. CSD's body of work on democracy and civic engagement began in 2000. In 2017, a concept note was written which gave birth to the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative. In 2018, the initiative's researchers conducted an empirical study seeking to observe differences in the electoral process and how these differences have affected the participation of registered voters, with intentional attention to race at 20 polling locations in the St. Louis area during the November 2018 election. Findings showed that those polls in communities with higher percentages of Black residents and lower income had fewer election judges, longer lines in the evening, and more interference with the free passage of voters. For example, crowded doorways and electioneering. The full report can be found on the CSD website. The goal of the VAE initiative is to develop a strategy for engaging the public about voting and voting barriers through its research, and this webinar series is a continuation of that strategy. We're here today because voting is a right to U.S. citizenship and is how Americans decide who represents them. However, the U.S. has made the act of voting complicated for citizens, meaning that if a person is not thoughtfully engaged in the process to vote, they will most likely not vote. However, the field of social work is fighting to make the process of voting simpler by engaging social workers to help citizens navigate the complexities of voting. After all, social work has been at the forefront of electoral democracy in this country for years. In fact, many of the social work advocates date back to the passage of the 19th Amendment and before, which gave white women the right to vote. Today's webinar is to spotlight the activities and systems for social workers relative to voting. With that, I want to introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker today is Tanya Rhodes Smith, who directs the Nancy A. Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work and is an instructor in residence at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. As director, she leads the Institute's Campaign School for Social Workers, which has trained 2,400 plus students, social workers, and advocates from across the country to lead in politics, developed evaluated training modules on voter engagement as social work intervention, supports political participation and voter turnout in communities, and advocates for expanded voting rights and access. In 2015, she co-founded the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign, also known as Voting in Social Work, which works to integrate voter engagement into social work education and practice. Tanya's teaching experience includes political advocacy, political social work, and program development and evaluation. She has collaborated on numerous journal publications. She is a proud political social worker, voting rights advocate, and campaign volunteer. Her experience includes legislative advocacy, community organizing, research, and leadership development. She serves on numerous coalitions and committees, including the Hartford Vote OTAS Coalition. She will discuss the engagement of social workers in voting and democracy. So you ready, Tanya? Let's begin.
Like all macro social workers, I've done just about every job out there. So I'm so pleased to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I have a slide I'm going to share with everybody. I hope we'll get some questions in the chat. I'm really love working with Gena on our national work, and look forward to a great conversation today. So let me share my screen. And let's hope the weather holds out for those of you who are in the Midwest and affected by it. So as I said, today we are going to take a deep dive on social work. And let me just tell you a little bit about the Humphreys Institute, because I think that our work really connects and supports this holistic and this ideal of an inclusive democracy. So the mission of the Institute is to increase the political participation and the power of social workers and the communities that we serve, so that public policy responds to the needs of all people. And here's a picture of Nancy Humphreys, who founded the Institute 26 years ago. And she was my professor, my mentor, my field advisor, and my friend when I was in school. And I'm so proud to lead this, to carry on her legacy through the Institute. And I mentioned this idea of an inclusive democracy. And for us, that means that it works for and responds to all individuals. And I wanted to just sort of give an introduction of how we work and think about democracy, because, you know, in some ways, we often will think about one election and how democracy is broken, and we don't think about this larger system. And so, you know, in an inclusive democracy, what we're thinking about is who votes really matters. Who turns out? Elected officials respond to voters. There's numerous studies that show that they give more attention and more resources to voters. So voting ourselves, engaging others to vote, and addressing the systemic barriers to vote are all really important in that. Who's in office matters. And I'll paraphrase a social worker who serves in Congress, Senator Debbie Stabenow. It's far easier to spend some money and some time getting the right people elected than to spend a lot of money and a lot of time getting the wrong people to do the right thing. So we think a lot about this process of who's getting elected, who's getting even on the ballot themselves, working on campaigns, donating to campaigns. So all of that to get the right people in office. Who's counted, participating in the decennial census that is so central to political power in our country, because the census determines voting districts and ultimately, oftentimes, elections. So ending partisan gerrymandering is really important. And then lastly, who's shaping policy? We think about public policy and shaping it from both the inside, not just who's in office, but social workers who work in politics, maybe work for an elected official, inside tables of power, and then also outside. So who's participating in the democratic process to shape advocacy so that it does meet the needs of our clients and it reflects the values of our profession. So I'll take a little bit of a dive on our work, and I'll start with voter engagement and also tell you how we address the elected official side. But first, we think about and examine voter engagement as a social work intervention. We have developed an evaluated model to integrate nonpartisan voter engagement training into social work classroom and field education. That's been a multi-year effort with a number of faculty that we collaborate with across the country. We train social workers and agencies how to integrate this work into their services. As Gena mentioned, we are co-founders with the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign. Our co-chairs are Dr. Terry Mizrahi and Dr. Mimi Abramovitz. We share and support the website for that work, which is Voting is Social Work, and we're very open access with a lot of our tools, trying to make this work easy. We work in coalitions. We are very active in expanding voting rights and access in our state, and then even working with others outside of our state. But one of the things that has been really central in the pandemic is expanding voting rights for voting by mail and absentee ballots. It is one example. But the other area that we've been really active in for years is working to end all forms of felony disenfranchisement. We really see that as central to social justice and responsive policy. So we collaborate with grassroots partners on that, and then we are, really work on this Power of Three campaign. We're part of the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign. We have a Power of Three campaign that's training and distributing materials so that all social workers can engage voters in this year and beyond. So I will talk more about all of these things as we go. I also want to say that we, again, thinking about all those aspects of democracy, we train social workers to do the inside and outside work. So our campaign school for social workers is now in its 26th year. This year it was so exciting. It was my first event in person in March, was the one we held at UConn, and we sold out. We had, I think, 12 states and 28 schools represented. It was fabulous. And then we were able to do it again 3 weeks later down at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And here's where we really see politics as leadership, opportunities for social workers. Not only do we think social workers are uniquely qualified to run for office and serve as elected officials, but also we encourage all social workers to just get involved in politics in your local communities and campaigns and in town committees and party committees, all the places that shape who's on the ballot and who ultimately wins elections. And not just for that one election, but also to build social works networks of power, so that we know who to call. Campaigns are great opportunities for social workers to connect with policymakers. So we talk about that. Running for office is often a long runway. So thinking about yourself as a leader and why you're qualified early on in your career is really, we think that's the right time to talk about why you're qualified to run and serve. We also work with lobby days and train students to testify at public hearings. At UConn, for example, I teach political advocacy. All my students have to testify in a public hearing in front of our state legislature. And so I've been just finishing that process now. And then giving students the opportunity to practice what they learn in the classroom. Democracy is a practice sport. You learn by doing. So anything that we can do that gets social workers closer to democracy, registering voters, working on campaigns, running drives, all those things are really important. Talking with public officials, we see all of that as building your confidence, not just your competence to engage in democracy. So I don't see the chat. I will just say, and maybe I can see the chat if I get myself together, but if there's any questions, I welcome, I welcome them as I'm going. I'm happy to stop and take questions. In terms of voting, I just want to remind everybody, we're going to spend a lot of time on how you do this work. We had an incredible presentation 2 weeks ago through the Center for Social Development on voting rights and the current attack on voting rights and how difficult it is. And today we really want to help you all engage in supporting people to vote. And I say that the one thing I think that's really important for us to remember as social workers is that voting is a social determinant of health. You know, individuals who vote and communities that vote in higher rates are healthier, wealthier, and better off, but they report higher rates of mental health, higher rates of employment and earnings. There's all these outcomes that improve when there is higher voter turnout. It's an important human right. It's part of self-determination. And it's really how we create a government that works for all people. And, you know, I think what we're seeing across the country in terms of rolling back rights is one piece of addressing democracy and this manufactured myth, this intentional myth that your vote doesn't make a difference. And I hear this from our students sometimes. I hear this all the time, that voting doesn't matter. You know, nothing changes. And I will say that, first of all, they're thinking about usually one election. They're thinking about the presidential election. And you're right, if you only vote in one election or think about that one role, democracy probably doesn't feel very responsive to you. And so it's really important in our work to bring this local. And on every level, I think all politics is local, and it's really the best place to start. And when we look at the turnout, you know, we even think about, okay, well, more people voted in the last election in 2020 than we have seen in decades. And that was 67% of eligible Americans. So it was a record year, and yet 80 million people stayed home. And that's a lot. That's a lot of people. And even more startling is who stays home on congressional and local elections. So sometimes turnout in a local election can be as low as 5%. We had an election recently in Hartford, Connecticut, and the turnout was 5%. So that's 5% who have power in that community in that election, and the policies are going to be more responsive to that 5%. So it's really an important piece of the puzzle for us, is to look at voter turnout, not only in the context of a location, so a city. I often will map voter turnout and see where power or correlates to power. We'll look at a state, and you can overlay things like arrest rates and incarceration and see the impact of that on voter turnout. And within a state, and then, you know, across the country, you can see where voter turnout matters. And across the country, what we do know is the swing states get more attention and more resources from Congress as well. So it starts locally and goes all the way up. And we had 2 weeks ago, as part of this series, we had this incredible conversation around some of the structural barriers and that feed into voter suppression right now. And we are seeing it across the country. We're seeing this rollback of rights. It is appalling. And there is a role for us in terms of fighting for our rights and standing up for democracy. There's another piece of this, though, that I think is also really important for us as social workers, and where all of us can really make a difference, is to understand that the engagement barriers also keep people from voting. And these are longer term barriers. They're about, to address them requires conversations. There's not even a lot of studies that look at why non-voters don't vote, but the ones that do, show that really these narratives of my vote doesn't matter, the system is rigged, election is rigged, it makes no difference who votes, everything stays the same. all of these for us are really engagement barriers, and these really work hand in hand to suppress voter turnout. And I will talk a little bit about how we address those as well. And to remind you, or to say that voting is about relationships. You know, oftentimes, again, we think about somebody's relationship and trust in their government, their relationship to their community, their relationship to political campaigns, because political campaigns often ignore non-voters, so that lack of relationship. So all of this sort of goes into your decision to vote. And one piece that I think reinforces this idea of voting being good for people and good for communities is this incredible work that's done by the websites here, the Democracy Index, and where they have really mapped out voter policy, voting policies. They've come up with a number. So for states that make voting easier, you would that's across the x-axis, so more voting access to the right, and then they overlay that with outcomes. So in this case, it's health outcomes, and they have a number that they've created from a group of indicators, and it's all very transparent and within their website. But you can see the correlation between easier to vote and better health outcomes. And they do a number of outcomes. So I think it's a really great example and illustration of how powerful this right to vote is on our well-being. So now let's look and pivot a little bit to voting as a social work intervention. And we see it as something that all social workers can and should engage in as part of their practice. From the micro level, we think about registering and engaging voters. And I use the term engage pretty broadly because we can register as many people as we want, but if they don't actually make it to the polls on election day, then it won't matter that we registered, 10,000 people if none of them voted. So when I say register and engage, we're always talking about getting people not just, to the polls, but also the information that they need to vote and be informed voters so that they can vote in their interest. So information about how to vote, when to vote, where to vote, how to find information on candidates and the encouragement to vote. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Voting as a social work intervention, when we think about meso practice and in communities, really reinforcing that voting is a we activity. We often think about it as a me activity, but it is very much a we activity, and figuring out how we share that when you stay home, the political power of your entire community stays home too. So, and reinforcing that relational and that social aspect of voting. It is very much a social behavior. And one of the powerful things that a lot of us do is wear our stickers, I voted, which can really motivate others to vote. And even social media has really picked up on this. I think I'm not on Facebook very often, but when I am, I see on election day, it makes me very happy to see people say that they voted. And I think there's some ways that they've made that really much easier. And then in terms of macro social work, those of us, when we think about that continuum, where social workers practice, fixing the systemic barriers and advocating for voting rights and access. So let's get into it. I'd like to get into some things that you can do that will make you, that will bring this to your practice. Now, again, it's a continuum, but I think that all of these are relatively simple things, and they will also build your lens about voting that I think are because voting for some of us seems very easy. In my community, I drive up to the polls, I park, there's plenty of parking. there's no line. We know that it's harder to vote when you have to take a bus, when you have childcare issues, when you are more likely to stand in very long lines, which we know happens across the country. So even just the experience of voting and recognizing that voting for some of us is very easy, where voting for other people is very challenging, is an important thing for all social workers to know about their state and their community. So know the facts, not just about the facts about the rules on voting, but the experience on voting and which communities are facing more challenges and more barriers. Register people all year long. If you are a social worker in a healthcare setting, we'll make sure that you ask about it. Maybe it's an intake. You can do an organizational assessment from any in any place that you practice to figure out the right time to ask people about their voter registration status. Do you have the information that you need to register to vote in these elections? Social workers navigate complex systems all the time. So sharing information is part of what we do. Navigating complex systems is part of what we do. So we work with agencies to do this, and we will often kind of figure out the right time and the right place, because again, we are also working sometimes with populations that are in crisis. So you have to think about that too. So share information about when to vote. And I will stress that in communities where one party is dominant, primaries are central. And those have the lower turnout, and that determines who's on the ballot. So local elections, primary elections, they need more encouragement, more excitement, and more information to people around those elections, because they're so under-publicized. Sharing information about elected officials and candidates and issues. You know, the one thing that all of us can do is on the next time that you go to vote, whether you're voting in the community where you practice or whether you're voting in your own community, how easy is it to find information? Vote411.org, which is the League of Women Voters, that is a nationally trusted, common source of information. But the League of Women Voters isn't in all communities, particularly in underserved communities. And so there may be no online or easily accessible resource about for candidates in your community. And I wanted to share this wonderful, we had a student at the campaign school, Lauren Porter, who is a student about to graduate at the University of Southern Mississippi. And she is in a district of Mississippi along the coast that has very low voter turnout. So she created a flyer to try to inform people about the candidates that are coming up, the primary election on June 7th, the candidates that are running and the deadlines. I just loved it. So I asked her yesterday if I could share it. And she said that she would be willing to make others. So I just think it's fantastic because she knows, she sees it in her community, the lack of engagement. So big shout out to Lauren there. And again, encouraging people, getting out, getting excitement, reminding them that their vote matters. And all year long, trying to create this relationship people need with their elected officials. So inviting them to your agency, helping somebody call their elected official if they have a need, you know, reminding them that elected officials work for them and are accountable to them. These are all ways that social workers build sort of civic engagement in this closer and voting as a practice. So these are some ideas for micro. I'll move on to meso. And Gena, jump in if there's any questions that come up. But examining voter turnout in your city, I mentioned this earlier. I think this as a community assessment is underutilized in social work education and in social work practice. I cannot stress enough that you can often look at a community and see where the turnout is highest, and then start to notice that that particular voting district or that particular neighborhood has more streetlights, better roads, perhaps they have better schools, perhaps the policing is different. You know, all of the ways that we look at well-being and power in communities, that can be overlaid by voter turnout. And in cities too, when you have turnout that is 10 to 15 to 25, even to 30% turnout, which in some cases is very high, you can see that elected officials are accountable to a very small number of people. And I also have seen firsthand in our own, in my state and across the country, that when they are accountable to so few people, you can often get some very toxic politics there. And you know, I think that we need to really double down on civic engagement at the local level. And we've seen it. I spent most of my career in a city called Bridgeport, and it has had some real challenges. And we've now had to advocate for an election monitor just to keep an eye on the politics. So again, more people voting brings more accountability, more transparency, and more sunlight to politics. So offer training. My second thing is to offer training on why voting matters to your community. I'm working with, we've always felt like the why piece on why voting matters is really important for anybody to understand. And you know, the model that I mentioned earlier that we have done and evaluated in schools of social work really starts with that. It examines all the ways that voting matters to social work practice, the ways that it connects to our mission, connects to our code of ethics, it connects to our values, and it connects most importantly to our impact. All the ways that it connects to every agency's work. You know, that why is really central. And I'll give you an example. We, as part of the Institute 26 years ago, when Nancy founded it, the organization, we put together packets of information around running voter drives in field placements every year. And when I was a part of the Institute 25 years ago or 22 years ago, I put those packets together. And they included voter registration forms, they included fact sheets on all the rules, and we would always have a letter that said, you should do this, it's part of our code of ethics. But that you should do it, never really moved the bar. They went unopened. Very few students actually took us up on running voter registration drives, except in presidential elections. We had some of our macro students and our community organizers get excited about it. But for the most part, we did not see our students who were focusing on direct practice with individuals, groups, and families really thinking that this was relevant to them and the work that they did. So it wasn't until we started the model and we developed training that really brought in this idea of critical consciousness, which is something we're doing more of, thanks to a colleague of mine, and that we started to change the bar. And we see big outcomes now in changes of planned future behavior after doing the training, after having students actually register voters as part of a field assignment. We see, not only do we have a surge in voter registrations, but we have students who are more likely to see the importance of voting themselves and of integrating this into their practice. My third suggestion in terms of sort of examples here is to create awareness and partner with civic groups. You don't have to be the expert. Politics can feel very overwhelming, and I think it's one of the reasons why people don't vote. They really don't understand who represents them at all levels of government. They get confused by the rules. It's 50 states, it's 50 rules, it's deadlines that, how do you possibly keep track of all of it? So partnering with civic groups is also a really great strategy for doing this work in your local community. And League of Women Voters would be the most, would be one of the examples, but there are many civic groups out there in most cities and communities. I encourage all of you to work at the polls on election day. That will also build your civic IQ and understand the barriers to voting in your community. I have heard that Ohio, and I think it's Pennsylvania, actually offers CEs for working at the polls on election day. I would love to see that in all 50 states. And as I said, really the importance of understanding the barriers to voting in your community. And I want to say too that macro social workers also have a lot of work to do. We all need to start saving democracy. It is in peril. It is under attack. And in most states right now, there is legislation to roll back rights. And we also need to be doing things like changing felony voting laws. So become an election monitor. If you don't want to be a poll worker, you can work with the league and you can testify, you can advocate for expanded rights and access. So democracy is up to all of us. So now I'm going to pivot to some tools and introduce the Power of Three campaign before we open it up for questions. And one of the things I want to share is that technology is making this easier for all of us so that we don't have to memorize all the rules. We need to know when elections are. We need to know whether a person with a felony conviction can vote and when they can vote. We do need to know some rules so that we can be advocates. But in terms of voter registration, this is changing the game. If you want to, if you've got a smartphone, you can point your smartphone right to that QR code on the screen, or you can text vote space SW to 3444. And we are partnering with an organization called VoteER that uses the TurboVote platform. It's a nonpartisan platform that does two things. One, it takes the registration out of you being the person to register somebody and making it so that they are registering themselves. And that's an important distinction in some states. The other thing is that this is also capacity building because TurboVote sends text messages to anybody who registers with them or even just puts in their cell phone or their email address. They will remind them to vote in all elections. So I will share my own experience with it. 3 or 4 years ago, I had signed up with TurboVote. I'd reached out to them. We were partnering with them on some other things. And I got a text message 30 days before a special election in my town that I had no idea about, even me. So, you know, this can be a game changer in terms of just reminding people when there are elections and carrying on that relationship to remind them. So very excited about how we use technology these days. And that leads me into the Power of Three campaign. So this is something that all of you can do, is to imagine if all 700,000 plus social workers engage 3 voters and then encourage that person to engage 3 voters and so on and so on. You know, this is a really simple campaign that the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign launched in February. We're excited about it. We'll be working on it all year long. It's something simple that people can do, especially if you are just getting started into this work. You can simply engage 3 people. And if they're already registered, you can ask them, especially if you're using technology, well, would you like to have a reminder before elections? So you don't have to necessarily just register them. You can include people that are registered that might want to receive text messages. The other thing about those text messages I didn't say is it tells you where to vote, your polling place and your current address, which is super important for people who are highly mobile, and renters or others who change addresses more frequently than homeowners. We have a fact sheet that I will drop in the chat in 1 second, or this flyer that will give you all the information you need. And the website, we have a website, the votingisocialwork.org website. You can find all the resources that we're talking about today. You can find information about registering special populations like folks experiencing homelessness, survivors of violence. There's all the special populations that we serve are included on the website and information for that. It also includes tools if you're a student or faculty or anybody who wants to bring this to your classroom or your practice, and even including things like this phone screensaver that you can just put right on your cell phone, so that if you don't have a lanyard, like I mentioned, or that I use, and you can get from VoteR, you can do it right from your cell phone. This is a picture of the website, and I'm not going to go through it right now, but the links in the flyer will take you there, and I will drop the link in the chat, and it's very simple. We had a great group of students and that redesigned our website, so it's even simpler than it was before. We think it's going to be a great tool, and we can't wait to share more stories. And that is my presentation. I think that I'm just about ready for comments, and I wanted to take a breath because I can go back on any of this and expand. Oh, Gena, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your great presentation. The work that you're doing at the Humphreys Institute is just short of amazing. Nothing short of amazing. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. One of them, the first one is, and it's actually several from one person. How does the Humphreys Institute reach schools of social work and push programs to implement this important work in all social work programs? And does it include any work with CSWE to emphasize the need? And what would it take to require all SSSW social work programs to include significant education, programming, practice related civic engagement?
Well, it's a great question, and it's why we and it's part of the mission of the national campaign that you're a part of, I'm a part of, is to really change social work education and integrate this into social work education. Yes, we want to mobilize social workers across the country, but we also really want to integrate this into education. And right now there's no systematic way to do that, but I will say this: we have a worksheet that shows that voter activities tie to all 9 of these CSW's competencies. And I think it would be nothing short of amazing if we could get voting activities onto every social work student's educational contract. That's where they learn, or they learn by doing. And so, and we've always conceptualized this as student-driven innovation and practice. So if we could do this, if we could make a commitment to do this as in social work education in all schools, then we could change social work practice. And here's how we do it at the Humphreys Institute, and where we piloted. We piloted, I mentioned the power of 3. Dr. Maren Hilton, who was one of my partners on the model, we piloted it at University of Nevada, Reno when she was there. She's now at Salisbury University, but we piloted it at UConn, and it included a training, and then it included an assignment tied to field. And the first year we noticed that field supervisors were a barrier. No, we don't do that. Students don't have any power, so we've never required or suggested that you require that they register voters at their field. You can give them an assignment that is register any 3 voters, but you can give them assignments around doing an organizational assessment that they turn into class, but they do collaboratively with their field supervisors. So we were very intentional about the assignments, recognizing that students don't have power and agencies necessarily to change policy or practice. But what we were successful in doing was adding a short training for new field supervisors and for all field supervisors. So at UConn, for example, we would use that opportunity to give free CEs, like, programs we do with the national campaign too, but free CEs, but integrating it into our CIFI training was really central for us. And so, and back to doing it for all schools, we have partnered with other schools and we share our materials. It really consists of one training, 1 2-hour training, and we have the instruments that you can use, the pre and the post survey instruments that Dr. Shannon Lane helped me develop, and then all the tools that go along with it, and many of them are on voting and social work.
Thank you. And I also just want to add too, I think that each school is unique and that you have to figure it out one little piece at a time. And, one of the other things is to connect with some of the national organizations. And so in that way, you're kind of following a playbook and everyone's sort of doing the same thing, but each one is unique. Yeah.
Such a great point. And I think it's a big hurdle to integrate it like we have for all social work students, or it's a required course, but you can start small and students can do a lot too. And individual faculty can bring it into their classroom. So I agree with you, Gena. It's a continuum, and it's recognizing also the political context of different schools and how schools navigate that.
Yeah. So one of the things that we do at our school is I teach a 1-hour class. So that's one way of getting students to buy into this whole voting and voter access. So there's another question here that I'm not real sure if I really want. I may have to recharacterize this a little bit, but how do you think about the election and subsequent positions of social workers that are in the legislature that don't necessarily align with the things that you've talked about today? How does that fit within the model that you just described?
Well, it's interesting. I do think we had a great conversation and panel at the last campaign school on leadership in a divided democracy, and really how we navigate. Sometimes we are aligned as social workers, and sometimes we differ on policy priorities. And so we had a great conversation that really gave students some tools of thinking about how you can be aligned on one issue and perhaps maybe not aligned on another issue. And I'll give you an example. We had 2 social workers who were talking about, one has been doing a lot of works for the ACLU and a lot on criminal justice reform and political power. And so we partner with them quite often. But we have a legislator who is also an alum and who has been on the forefront of, survivors' rights in terms of sexual assault survivors, domestic violence. And so sometimes they're not aligned. They're not always eye to eye, but they talk about that. The difference in policy is okay. They can come together on 95% of every other thing. So I think that sometimes we have to allow some difference in priorities, but still collaborate on the things that we mostly, 95%, I would say, share. Now, I can't speak to, I mean, I think the elephant in the room is sometimes, you know, there are social workers in very national, visible positions that are really conflicting with, or there's one that's conflicting with a lot of our values. And so that's a different issue. You know, that's one person. I think primarily you'll find that most social workers align pretty much with our professional values.
Okay. So I have another question that says, are there policies in some agencies that forbid political, not partisan work in the agencies? And let's see, we have hit a wall with some organizations that say we cannot be political. Some places seem to think that sharing voter information, like how to register or request an absentee ballot, is considered partisan. And my university is one of those schools that doesn't particularly care for the word political. But maybe if you can explain that a little bit more, how do you navigate around that?
I love the question. And so nonpartisan voter engagement is exactly that. And we have to use that term nonpartisan all the time. And we have to remind people that we're not telling them who to vote for, that we're giving them the information they need, the when to vote, where to vote, how to vote, and information to be an informed voter. But I think that we can look to national legislation, the 1993 Voter Registration Act, which is also called the Motor Voter Law, which says that state agencies have to give voters the opportunity to register. And that also applies to nonprofits who are registered or who are signing people up for federal programs. So in some cases, agencies might be violating the law by not allowing people the opportunity to register. And then you can start looking at things like Hatch Act, and there's some things on our website. I've worked with Dr. Mizrahi, who I know is on this call. We have some letters from VAs even. We get a lot of pushback from VA hospitals on doing this work, or on VA agencies, and they can, in fact, support people to vote. So I would say don't, work on it. There has always been this idea of equating voting and voter engagement with partisan politics. And we just have to use that language and take it out of partisan politics and look at it as community well-being and part of your mission. And I think there's more. I will say one other thing is that philanthropy is now really starting to invest heavily in connecting not just the direct services that they have funded for years and years and years, and they're starting to see that these problems that they fund year after year are never going to change without some civic involvement. So in the 2 years ago, we saw in my state a heavy investment by community foundations in census outreach and in civic engagement. So in really trying to engage more people to be voters. So look at your community in that.
So another question, taking the long view on education, are school social workers being engaged with helping to push civic education for kids and parent voter registration at primary and secondary schools? Is there any impact studies on K through 12 civic education and voting that you're aware of?
So let me say there's a lot of impact. I mean, when you do training, one of the things that students, or even in our own classrooms, if you ask students when they registered to vote, most will say, I registered, or some will say, I registered to vote for the first time in my high school. Now, we've lost a lot of that practice in high schools, even in my state, which requires one semester of civics in high school. If you don't catch somebody if you don't catch a student in their senior year, you miss this opportunity to really connect them to be the bridge to their first voting experience. So I will say that. And then I love this question about school social workers, because when I first started training in our school, half of our students are in schools, and they would say, well, this doesn't apply to me. I'm in an elementary school. What can an elementary school do to engage voters? Well, parents register children all the time. Why can't we ask parents if they have updated their voter registration status? Why aren't we using in schools? Why aren't we using the sophisticated outreach we have to parents, not as a way to say vote for somebody, but it's to say, hey, there's a reminder, there's a local election happening. Why, here's your polling place, and here's the information you need to be a voter. They could even just remind people about the election. So I feel like there's this issue of schools in general building civic literacy and making a commitment to it, and their connection to parents. And then in terms of school social workers who are in high school, I think they have the opportunity to be such change makers when they think about, connecting and encouraging young people to be civically engaged, and reminding them or helping them register to vote for the first time. I also know that school social workers are overworked, underpaid, and outnumbered. So I recognize that there is a gap there, but I see the potential so clearly that, of what we could do in partnership, maybe facilitated by social workers to bring in the partners that do this work. I just think there's a lot of ways that we could do more.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. There's a couple of comments. One is from Terry that says there's a difference between political and partisan. It's absolutely legal and ethical to do anything except who to vote for or which party, which sort of answers I got a question from someone asking how come I didn't want to call out a particular legislator, and that it could be seen as something other than what we're trying to do is why I didn't specifically name any names. Personally, if you call me, I'd love to have a conversation with you one-on-one, but not on this platform about it. There's another question that says, why not have kids vote for things at school? Should it be pizza or hamburgers on Fridays at school? They will remember their experience, and some will even learn to lobby.
Gosh, I am old enough to remember voting in my school, and that before polling became so widespread, that the turnout and the results of kids voting in schools was a great predictor of who would win, because, kids would vote the way their parents voted. So, there is so much opportunity there. And I think, for anybody who does this sort of work, whether it's with kids, whether it's with social workers, whether it's with anybody, it's you learn by doing. You don't learn it from a textbook. You learn by meeting your legislator and then having a face in a name to a face, and realizing that they're pretty normal, just like we are. I think, and I saw somebody really briefly out of the corner of my eye spoke about county government. And when I say local, I do mean county as well. And it's really important. And actually, one of our longtime speakers at the campaign school is a social worker who was chair of the county legislature and is now running for Congress. So, social workers can do this work in lots of ways, and local and county government also is a pipeline to more national government. So again, every level matters. I'm not discriminating.
Okay, so we've just got a minute or so left. There are a couple of amazing things that are happening in the chat, so make sure you look at them. But I think we need to stop where we are. Again, want to thank Tanya for being our presenter today. I think she did a fabulous job. If we can ask everybody to give her a hand silently, I'd appreciate that. So before we end, I want to thank our co-sponsors, which are the National Association of Social Work, the Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated Gamma Omega Chapter, the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, the League of Women Voters in St. Louis, In Every Generation, the Grand Challenges of Social Work, the St. Louis Voting Initiative, and the St. Louis Area Voter Protection Coalition. We are so excited to have had you for our co-sponsors. I also wanted to thank our CSD team, Tanika Spencer, Chris Fleiker, and Lissa Johnson, and our CSD Center Director, Dr. Michael Schradden. I also want to thank the participants for joining us today. It's so important. We're so excited that you were here to get this information. And just so you know, this webinar recording will be posted on YouTube, and we will contact you after it is posted. And finally, the next two webinars in this series will be Wednesday, September 7th and 28th, with the following topics: disinformation and misinformation, and civic engagement and education. And we will send announcements beginning in August or September for that. So this concludes this session, and thanks again for joining us today.